I was sitting in a freezing pre-op room with an IV needle already taped into my arm, 30 minutes away from letting a surgeon cut out my left kidney to save my husband's life. Then his phone screen lit up with a text from his brother's white wife thanking him for the kidney and reminding him to sign the divorce papers so they could finally pay off her mortgage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had the people you love most try to play you for a fool. The air in Emory University Hospital was sterile and biting cold. I sat in a stiff plastic chair wearing a thin hospital gown that offered zero protection against the chill. I was 35 years old and I had spent the last 8 years of my life building a fortress around my husband Andre. He was lying in the hospital bed right next to me, snoring softly. The heavy pre-op sedatives the nurses had administered 20 minutes prior had already pulled him under. He looked peaceful. He looked completely innocent. He looked like the man I had married and the man I thought I was saving. Andre had been suffering from rapidly declining renal function for the past year. When the doctors told us he needed a transplant, I did not even hesitate. I went through weeks of grueling testing, blood work, and psychological evaluations. When they told me I was a perfect match, I cried tears of joy. I was ready to give up a piece of my own body to ensure my husband could live a long, healthy life by my side. His phone buzzed against the hard plastic of the tray table wedged between my chair and his bed. It was a sharp, vibrating sound that cut through the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors attached to his chest. I leaned over. My only intention was to switch the device to silent so his rest would not be disturbed before the orderlies came to wheel him into the operating theater. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room. I did not even have to touch the glass. The lock screen notification was right there in plain text, impossible to misunderstand. It was from Chloe. Chloe was my brother-in-law, Taryn's wife. She was a petite blonde woman who always played the role of the sweet, supportive sister-in-law at every family cookout, always bringing her famous potato salad and smiling brightly in Taryn's face. The message read, "Just get her kidney and sign the divorce papers. Then we can finally pay off my house. Love you, baby." I read the words 3 times. I stared at the glowing letters until the screen automatically dimmed and went black. A heavy, absolute silence dropped over my mind. There were no tears. There was no sudden gasp of disbelief. There was no screaming or falling to my knees. Women like me, women who build elite crisis management and public relations firms from the ground up, do not waste time crying when the building is on fire. We locate the exits and we shut off the gas. I looked at Andre sleeping so soundly. Everything clicked into place with terrifying speed. The late nights he claimed he was working on his failing real estate developments, the sudden massive expenses he needed me to cover to save his business ventures, the way Chloe would always find an excuse to pull him aside at family dinners. He was not just cheating on me. I was actively plotting to harvest my organ to save his own life so he could immediately divorce me and run off with his brother's wife. They were planning to use the massive financial settlement they assumed he would get from my tech and PR companies to pay off her house. I reached over to the crook of my left arm. I gripped the edge of the clear medical tape securing the IV tube to my skin. With one swift motion, I ripped the tape away. I grabbed the plastic hub of the needle and pulled it straight out of my vein. A warm stream of blood immediately ran down my forearm, dripping onto the pristine white linoleum floor. I reached out with my other hand, grabbed a thick square of sterile gauze from the nearby supply cart, and pressed it hard against the puncture wound. I stood up. The cold air hit my bare legs, but I barely felt it. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door swung open. A young nurse walked in carrying a clipboard and a fresh bag of saline solution. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from the drops of blood on the floor to the IV line dangling uselessly off the side of my chair and finally to my face. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice pitching up in immediate panic. "You cannot remove that yourself. You are scheduled for the transplant in exactly 30 minutes. We are about to start your prep." I looked her dead in the eye and kept my voice completely flat and perfectly steady. "The surgery is off. The donor is withdrawing consent." The nurse dropped her clipboard onto the counter. It made a loud clattering sound that barely caused Andre to shift in his drug-induced sleep. "Ma'am, you are his match," she stammered, taking a step toward me, with her hands raised as if trying to calm a wild animal. "If we do not proceed with this transplant today, his renal function will decline rapidly. He is already prepped. The entire surgical team is scrubbing in right now. You are saving his life. I know I said applying more pressure to the gauze on my arm. I am fully aware of his medical chart, but under the law, a living donor can withdraw consent at any absolute moment before the anesthesia is administered. I am withdrawing my consent right now. Please page his attending physician and tell them to cancel the operating room. I did not wait for her to argue. I turned my back to her and walked over to the small plastic patient belongings bag tucked in the corner of the room. I unlaced the back of my hospital gown and let it drop to the floor. I did not care that the nurse was staring at me in utter disbelief. I pulled on my own clothes. I slid into my black tailored slacks. I buttoned my silk blouse. I slipped on my blazer. With every button, I fastened. I felt the remnants of my 10-year relationship peeling away, leaving only a sharp, icy clarity behind. I thought about how I had spent the last 5 years quietly funding his lifestyle. I thought about the luxury cars I leased for him so he could maintain his image as a successful developer among Atlanta's elite. I thought about how he smiled in my face every morning while plotting my physical and financial ruin with his brother's wife. The door flew open again. Dr. Eris, one of the top transplant surgeons at the hospital, rushed into the room looking breathless. He looked from the panicked nurse to me, now fully dressed in my street clothes and packing my purse. Camille, he started using a calm, measured tone designed to de-escalate medical emergencies. We have a highly orchestrated schedule here today. Your husband's life truly depends on this procedure. We have him stabilized for the surgery, but if we delay this now, we risk his body rejecting future treatments. You are his best chance. What has caused this sudden change of heart? I did not let him finish his prepared speech. Doctor, I respect your time and your medical expertise, I said, slipping my feet into my loafers and grabbing my handbag. But the man in that bed is currently engaged in a long-term affair with his brother's wife. They are actively plotting to finalize a divorce the moment he recovers, using my donated organ to ensure he survives long enough to try and drain my financial assets in court. The surgeon froze, completely stunned into silence. The nurse covered her mouth with her hand. So, unless you are going to physically hold me down and extract my kidney against my will, this conversation is over. I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. I am leaving. You can wake him up and tell him he needs to find a new donor. I turned toward the door, but before I could step out into the hallway, the sound of loud, hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor. The door was pushed wide open and the very people I was preparing to destroy walked right into the room. The heavy wooden door practically bounced off the wall as it was shoved open. Loretta marched into the pre-op room with the kind of aggressive entitlement she usually reserved for cutting the line at Sunday brunch. She was wearing a perfectly pressed, tailored suit and holding a designer handbag she bought using the monthly allowance I secretly provided to her son. Right behind her was Terrence, looking exhausted from pacing the waiting room, and trailing just a step behind him was Chloe. Loretta stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from the hospital gown discarded on the floor to the thick gauze pressed against my arm and finally settled on my tailored blazer. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. Camille, what in the world are you doing? She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Why are you in your street clothes? Doctor, Aries stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Ma'am, please keep your voice down. We are dealing with a sensitive medical situation. The donor has formally withdrawn her consent for the transplant. Loretta did not even look at the surgeon. She marched right up to me, her heels clicking furiously against the linoleum. You are withdrawing your consent. Are you out of your mind? My son is lying in that bed, fighting for his very life, and you are getting dressed to leave because you have cold feet. I looked at her. I looked at this woman who had spent the last decade making passive-aggressive comments about my demanding career, complaining that I did not cook enough traditional meals for her son, and implying I was not a proper wife. I kept my face entirely blank. It is not cold feet, Loretta, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. The surgery is candled. You typical selfish woman, she screamed, stepping so close, I could smell the strong floral perfume she bathed in. You have always put yourself first. You think because you run some fancy company and make your own money that you do not have to answer to anyone. But you owe my son this kidney. You stood before God and swore to love him in sickness and in health. You are his wife. You are going to take that jacket off, put that gown back on, and save my child. Or so help me. God. I will make sure everyone in Atlanta knows you tried to murder your own husband over some pathetic pre-surgery jitters. Terrence moved forward, placing a heavy hand on his mother's shoulder. "Mom, stop yelling," he said, looking between me and the doctor with deep confusion. "Camille, what is going on? Why are you bleeding? Are you sick? Did they find something wrong with the match?" Terrence was a good man. He was a hard-working high school principal who genuinely loved his brother and deeply loved his wife. He had no idea that the woman he shared a bed with was currently planning to pay off their mortgage using the financial fallout of my impending divorce. Before I could answer, Terrence Chloe stepped out from behind him. She pushed her blonde hair out of her face, letting her eyes well up with perfect theatrical tears. She had always been so good at this, playing the soft, innocent peacemaker. Whenever Loretta started a family argument, she walked right up to me, radiating fake sympathy, and reached out to gently grasp my forearm. "Camille, please," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I know surgery is terrifying. I know you are scared right now, but Andre is family. We all need him. Terrence needs his brother. I need my brother-in-law. Please do not do this to our family. Just take a deep breath and stay for Andre." I stared down at her pale hand resting on my dark sleeve. The sheer audacity of this woman was almost breathtaking. She was standing right in front of me, pretending to beg for my husband's life while her text message, actively plotting to bleed me dry, was still sitting on his phone, not 3 feet away. She was looking me right in the eyes, wearing the diamond earrings Terrence had bought her for their anniversary, playing the devoted, supportive sister-in-law, while secretly waiting for me to be wheeled into an operating room so she could continue sleeping with my husband. I felt a cold, powerful wave of absolute clarity wash over me. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked down at her hand, and then looked back up into her wide, fake, innocent eyes. I lifted my arm and slowly, deliberately brushed her hand off my sleeve, as if brushing away a diseased insect. Chloe took a startled step back, her lower lip trembling right on cue for Terrence to see. I turned my back on her and walked over to the medical tray table. The room was perfectly silent except for the rhythmic beeping of Andre's heart monitor and Loretta's heavy, furious breathing. I picked up Andre's phone. I tapped the screen and swiped up, entering the 6-digit passcode he thought I did not know. The message thread opened instantly. I did not say a single word as I turned around and walked directly toward Terrence. I held the phone out to Terrence. He looked down at the glowing screen and then up at my face, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Read it," I said, my voice carrying absolutely no emotion. "Read exactly what your brother and your wife have been planning while I was sitting in a hospital gown getting prepped to save his life." Terrence took the phone. I did not stay to watch his face fall. I walked straight past Loretta, who was still fuming, and pushed the heavy wooden door open, stepping out into the bright, sterile hallway of the transplant ward. I knew they would follow me. People who thrive on manipulation always need an audience to perform for. The heavy door swung shut behind me, but it was violently thrown open just seconds later. Terrence stormed out into the corridor, his large frame shaking with a sudden explosive rage. His eyes were wide, reading the text message over and over again, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves into something innocent. Chloe hurried out right behind him with Loretta stepping on her heels. "Terrence, what does it say?" Loretta demanded, trying to snatch the phone from his hand. "What is she showing you?" Terrence did not answer his mother. He turned slowly and locked his eyes on his wife. Chloe shrank back against the pristine white wall. Terrence stepped toward her, holding the phone up to her face. "You want him to sign the divorce papers so you can pay off your house?" he roared, his voice echoing down the entire ward. Nurses at the central station turned their heads in shock. Families in the nearby waiting area stood up to look. An empty transport wheelchair was sitting near the wall. Terrence grabbed the metal handles and shoved it violently. The wheelchair crashed against the baseboard, flipping onto its side with a loud metallic bang. Chloe dropped her sweet, innocent act entirely. She pressed her back against the wall, her hands raised defensively. "Terrence, baby, please." She stammered, her voice high and panicked. "It was a mistake. It was just a joke. We were just messing around because he was nervous about the surgery. It means nothing. I swear to you." "A joke?" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with a raw pain that made my chest tighten for him. "A joke about bleeding my sister-in-law dry and sleeping with my own brother in my house. You think this is funny, Chloe?" Loretta finally snatched the phone from Terrence's trembling hand. She pulled her reading glasses from her designer purse and peered at the screen. I watched her face closely, expecting to see the horror and shame that any normal mother would feel upon discovering her youngest son was engaged in such a vile betrayal against his own brother and his wife. But Loretta was not a normal mother. She was obsessed with the illusion of black excellence, and in her eyes, Andre was the epitome of it. She refused to see his flaws, and she certainly refused to hold him accountable. She lowered the phone and looked directly at me. Her expression did not hold an ounce of sympathy for Terrence or for me. It held pure, unfiltered venom directed entirely at my face. "This is your fault, Camille," she spat, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. Terrence looked at his mother in absolute disbelief. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice dropping to a shocked whisper. "He is sleeping with my wife. He just admitted to using Camille for her organs." But Loretta ignored her eldest son completely. She marched up to me, standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from her anger. "My son is a successful man," she screamed right there in the middle of the intensive care unit. "He has needs. You are always working at that public relations firm of yours, flying across the country for your business, ignoring your duties as a wife. A man like Andre needs a woman who actually pays attention to him. A man of his caliber needs to feel respected in his own home." I stared at her, letting her toxic and delusional words hang in the air. "You drove him to this?" Loretta continued, her voice growing louder and more frantic as hospital security guards began walking down the hall toward us. "You made him seek comfort somewhere else because you are too busy trying to act like you are the man of the house. But that does not change the fact that you owe him this kidney before God." I maintained my silence, simply watching her unravel. "You stood at the altar and promised to be there for him in sickness and in health," she demanded, her chest heaving with exertion. "You do not get to walk away and let my baby die just because your pride is a little hurt. You are going to march back into that room, put that gown back on, and give my son what he needs. You owe this family, Camille." I looked at Terrence, who was staring at his mother with tears of betrayal in his eyes, realizing that she cared more about defending her golden child than addressing the destruction of his own marriage. I looked at Chloe, who was slowly inching away from Terrence, clearly hoping the attention would remain on me so she could slip away. And then I looked back at Loretta. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout to be heard. I just let her words wash over me, completely unbothered by her desperate attempts to manipulate my conscience. She thought she could guilt me into returning to the slaughterhouse. She had no idea that I was already calculating my next move. The tense silence in the corridor was broken by a sharp, bitter laugh. It did not come from Loretta or Terrence. It came from Chloe. I turned my head to see her dropping the terrified victim act completely. She stopped inching away from her husband and stood up straight, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk blouse. The sweet, supportive sister-in-law was gone, replaced by the calculating opportunist who had been texting my husband about my organs just moments ago. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked me up and down with a sneer that twisted her pretty features into something ugly. "You think you are so smart, Camille," she said, her voice dripping with a newfound arrogance. "You think walking out of here makes you the winner? You are just delaying the inevitable." Terrence snapped his head toward her. "Chloe, shut your mouth right now," he warned, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. But Chloe ignored him completely. Her eyes were locked on me, filled with a smug superiority. She took a deliberate step forward, treating the hospital corridor like her own personal stage. "Andre has been talking to a divorce lawyer for weeks." She continued, her tone loud enough for the passing nurses to hear. "He knows exactly what your public relations firm is worth. He knows about the corporate accounts, the private investments, the commercial properties. You might be walking out of that operating room today, but Andre is going to take half of your business in the divorce anyway. He is entitled to it. You built that entire empire while you were married to him, so you might as well march back in there and give him the kidney so he can live long enough to spend your money." Loretta nodded her head in vigorous agreement, a triumphant smirk appearing on her face. "That is right," she chimed in, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with her daughter-in-law. "My son is entitled to half of everything you have hoarded for yourself. You owe him that much for being such a neglectful wife. He supported you emotionally while you built that company. The courts will give him exactly what he deserves." I stood there in the brightly lit hospital corridor listening to the two women who had plotted my physical and financial downfall. They actually believed they held the winning hand, They thought the threat of a costly, brutal divorce would force me to submit to their demands. They thought I was just a woman with a bruised ego who would eventually fold under the pressure of preserving my assets and my pristine public image. I felt a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of amusement or joy. It was a chilling, predatory smile that made Loretta take a sudden, slight step back. Her triumphant smirk faltered. I looked at Chloe, who was still wearing that smug, confident expression, and I let out a soft breath. "Actually, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice smooth and dangerously calm, "there is a small detail about my empire that you and Andre seem to have overlooked in your eager little planning sessions." I turned away from her and looked down the hallway. The commotion we had caused had finally attracted the attention of the hospital administration. A woman in a tailored navy suit with a badge identifying her as the floor director was hurrying toward us, flanked by 2 large security guards. She looked frantic, clearly aware that a major high-profile medical procedure was falling apart in her ward. "Ma'am?" the administrator said breathlessly as she reached us. "Please, we cannot have this kind of disruption in the intensive care unit. The surgical team is demanding to know the status of the donor." "Doctor," Aries says, "you are refusing the procedure, and the patient is currently sedated and prepped." I turned my full attention to the administrator. "Yes, I am the donor and I have formally withdrawn my consent," I stated clearly, ensuring the security guards and the nurses at the nearby station heard every single word. "But there is a crucial administrative update you need to make to the recipient's file immediately." Chloe scoffed loudly, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "What are you talking about, Camille? You cannot just change the subject to avoid the truth." I ignored her completely and kept my eyes locked on the administrator. "My husband, Andre, is currently admitted as a surgical patient. He was admitted using my premium corporate health insurance. It is a top-tier executive policy fully funded by the public relations firm that I own and operate. Since I am withdrawing as his donor due to his documented marital infidelity, I am also exercising my right as the primary policyholder." I pulled my smartphone from my purse. I opened my health insurance portal, navigating to the dependent section with swift, practiced movements. The hospital administrator watched me, her eyes widening as she realized exactly what I was about to do. "I am officially removing him from my policy." I announced, my voice carrying down the quiet corridor with crystal clarity. Effective immediately, the color drained completely from Chloe's face. Loretta let out a sharp gasp, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if trying to protect her own heart from stopping. "What did you just say?" Loretta demanded, her voice rising in a panicked, terrified squeak. "You cannot do that. He is in the middle of a medical crisis. He needs specialized care. The anti-rejection medications alone cost thousands of dollars." The administrator looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," she stammered, looking down at her clipboard and then back up at me. "If you remove him from the policy right now, all subsequent treatments, medications, and his stay in the intensive care unit will no longer be covered by insurance. The daily out-of-pocket costs for a patient in his critical condition are astronomical. Without premium coverage, he will be moved to the standard state wait list for a donor organ." I tapped the confirm button on my screen and held the phone up so the administrator could see the green checkmark indicating the change had been successfully processed. "Hi is no longer my dependent," I said, sliding the phone back into my leather handbag. "He is now a self-pay patient. Good luck." "No," Loretta screamed, lunging forward with her hands outstretched. "You vindictive, selfish witch. You are sentencing my son to death. You are ruining him." The 2 security guards instantly stepped between me and Loretta, holding up their hands to keep her at bay. "Ma'am," stepped back. One of the guards ordered, his tone firm and authoritative. "You need to calm down or we will have you removed from the hospital premises." Chloe was completely panicking now. Her smug arrogance had vanished, replaced by a frantic, terrified realization. Without my premium executive insurance, Andre would not only be kicked off the top-tier private transplant list, but he would also be saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt before he even managed to file the divorce papers. The massive financial settlement they planned to use to pay off her mortgage was evaporating right before her eyes, replaced by a mountain of insurmountable hospital bills. Terrence just stood against the wall, shaking his head slowly. He looked at his wife and his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You brought this on yourselves," he muttered, his voice heavy with profound exhaustion. You played a dangerous game with a smart woman and you lost everything. I am done with both of you. Terrence turned around and walked away, heading straight for the elevators. He did not look back when Chloe cried out his name. He did not stop when Loretta demanded he stay and defend his brother. He simply walked away, leaving them to face the devastating consequences of their own actions. I looked at Chloe, who was now trembling with actual fear, her hands shaking at her sides. You should probably call your mortgage lender, Chloe, I said, my tone dripping with false polite sympathy. I hear they are very unforgiving when you miss a payment. I turned on my heel and walked toward the elevators. The sound of Loretta screaming my name echoed down the hallway, mingling with Chloe's panicked sobbing and the stern voices of the security guards, demanding they lower their voices or face immediate ejection. I did not look back. I pressed the button for the lobby and watched the silver doors slide open. I stepped inside, pressed the ground floor button, and watched the doors close, shutting out the chaotic mess of the family I was finally leaving behind. As the elevator descended, my mind was already shifting gears. I had severed the medical tie and cut the insurance lifeline, but I knew Andre and Loretta would not stop there. They were desperate, and desperate people always try to claw back what they feel entitled to. They still thought they had a claim to the sprawling luxury estate in Buckhead. They thought Andre's name was on the deed just because he picked out the custom Italian marble for the kitchen islands and boasted about it to his friends. They had no idea how thoroughly I had insulated my assets from the very beginning of our marriage. As I walked out of the hospital lobby and handed my ticket to the valet, I pulled out my phone again. The game was far from over, and I needed to secure the perimeter before Andre woke up from his sedatives and realized his golden goose had flown the coop. I stepped out of the freezing hospital air and into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The valet recognized me immediately and sprinted to retrieve my black Porsche Panamera. I handed him a generous cash tip, slid into the pristine leather driver's seat, and shut the door. My phone was vibrating wildly in my purse. A relentless buzz of incoming calls from Loretta and text messages from numbers I did not recognize. I pulled the device out and switched it to Do Not Disturb. The silence inside the cabin of my car was instant and beautifully heavy. I shifted the car into gear and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead. As the tires glided over the smooth asphalt, my mind went to the sprawling 6-bedroom estate waiting for me at the end of my commute. It was the exact same estate Andre loved to brag about at our lavish dinner parties. He loved standing in the grand marble foyer, holding a glass of expensive scotch, telling his fraternity brothers how his keen eye for commercial real estate secured us the property. He loved playing the role of the ultimate provider, the brilliant businessman who gave his wife the world. It was all a carefully constructed and incredibly expensive illusion. The humiliating truth was that Andre had not closed a successful real estate deal in 4 years. His development company was nothing but an empty shell of bad investments, missed deadlines, and mounting debts. I was the one pulling in the massive revenue. My crisis management and public relations firm had landed 3 major corporate contracts just last year alone. I was bringing in millions while my husband was playing pretend in a rented downtown office space. But because I loved him, because I had bought into the toxic cultural expectation that a successful Black woman needs to shrink her own light to protect her husband's fragile male ego, I quietly funded his entire lifestyle. I paid the massive mortgage on the Buckhead estate. I leased his luxury vehicles so he could pull up to his meetings looking the part. I even quietly funneled thousands of dollars into his business accounts disguised as consulting fees so he could feel like the man of the house. I had compromised my own brilliance and silenced my own achievements just to keep him comfortable, and his repayment for my unwavering financial and emotional loyalty was plotting to slice me open, take my organ, and move his brother's wife into the very home my money paid for. I pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. The house sat perfectly manicured at the end of the long sweeping driveway, a monument to my hard work and his deception. I parked the Porsche in the expansive garage and walked through the side door into the massive gourmet kitchen. The silence of the huge house greeted me. It was pristine and quiet, but the energy in the space had completely shifted. It was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was a crime scene, and I was about to erase all evidence of the criminal. I walked straight to the utility closet and grabbed a fresh roll of heavy-duty industrial black trash bags. I marched up the sweeping curved staircase, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and pushed open the double doors to the master suite. I bypassed my side of the massive custom walk-in closet and headed straight for his section. Andre loved looking the part of the wealthy elite developer. His racks were lined with suits he bought using my credit cards. I tore a thick plastic trash bag from the roll and snapped it open. I started grabbing huge handfuls of his clothes. I yanked his suits right off the wooden hangers, not caring if the fabric tore. The garments he tried so hard to pass off as custom tailoring tumbled unceremoniously into the black plastic. I threw in his silk ties, his expensive loafers, his golf shirts, and the designer watches I had bought him for every anniversary. I was completely methodical. There was no frantic tearing or crying. There were no dramatic screams echoing in the empty room. There was just the steady rhythmic sound of plastic rustling and wooden hangers clattering aggressively to the hardwood floor. With every single bag I tied shut, another layer of my 10-year mistake was sealed away. I dragged the heavy black bags out to the hallway, lining them up against the textured wallpaper. Then I pulled out my mobile phone. I did not call a girlfriend to cry and vent. I called Malik, the head of the elite private security firm my company retains for our high-profile celebrity clients. I told him I had an urgent domestic situation and needed 2 armed professional guards stationed at my personal residence immediately. Malik did not ask me for emotional details. He simply took down my address and told me a unit was already en route. My next call was to a premium emergency locksmith service in the city. They quoted me a rush fee of $500 to guarantee an arrival time of under 20 minutes. I paid it without a second thought, giving them my gate code. I spent the next 20 minutes dragging the heavy trash bags down the grand staircase, pulling them across the foyer, and piling them directly on the front porch. I wanted his pathetic belongings to be the very first thing he saw when he inevitably showed up to claim a kingdom he never actually built. The locksmith arrived exactly on time, pulling his work van right up to the front steps. I instructed him to completely drill out and replace the deadbolts on the custom front, double doors, the garage entry point, and the back patio doors. I told him I wanted the absolute highest grade security hardware he carried in his vehicle installed on every single access point. The loud, harsh drilling and metallic clanking began to fill the quiet neighborhood, replacing the energy of quiet betrayal with the absolute sounds of fortification. Less than 10 minutes later, a matte black sport utility vehicle pulled into my driveway parking strategically near the entrance. 2 massive security guards stepped out dressed in dark tactical suits, with earpieces discreetly tucked into place. I greeted them at the door and handed them a printed color photograph of Andre, a photograph of his mother, Loretta, and a photograph of his mistress, Chloe. I looked the lead guard directly in the eyes and gave him my strict, unyielding instructions. These 3 individuals are permanently banned from this property. If they step foot past the front gate, they are trespassing, and the local police are to be called immediately. Do not engage in conversation with them. Do not let them explain themselves. Just remove them. The guards nodded, taking their positions at the perimeter of the property with military precision. The locksmith finished his work, wiping his hands on a towel, and handed me a heavy ring of new brass keys. I thanked him, saw him out, and locked the front door from the inside. I stood in my marble foyer and listened to the heavy, solid thud of the new deadbolt sliding firmly into place. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard all day. I stood by the tall glass panels flanking the front door and looked out over my property. The black trash bags sat on the porch like bloated, ugly monuments to his fake life. I pulled up my security application on my tablet and checked the high-definition cameras placed around the estate. The perimeter was entirely secured. My guards were stationed like statues at the front approach. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water, and stood by the large bay window. I knew Andre. He was reckless, deeply entitled, and entirely dependent on my financial resources. It was only a matter of time before the hospital administrators formally notified him that they would not treat him without my premium insurance coverage. The moment he realized he was about to be responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt, he would panic. He would come running back to the house he falsely believed he owned, expecting to use his loud voice and his mother's aggressive bullying to force his way back into my wallet. Let him come. I took a slow, calm sip of my water. I was ready. I did not have to wait very long. Exactly 3 hours after the locksmith secured my final deadbolt, a silver sport utility vehicle sped up my long driveway. The brakes squealed harshly as the car slammed to a halt just behind my security team parked near the entrance. It was Chloe's vehicle. The doors flew open and the three of them spilled out onto the pristine paving stones like a chaotic mess. Andre emerged from his back seat. He was still wearing the loose gray hospital sweatpants and a rumpled shirt he must have thrown on when he discharged himself against medical advice. The plastic hospital admission band was still clamped around his wrist. He looked pale and physically weak, but the sheer panic and rage contorting his face gave him a sudden burst of frantic adrenaline. The hospital administration had clearly delivered the devastating news about his self-pay status. He marched toward the front steps, moving with a reckless, desperate energy. Loretta and Chloe hurried right behind him. In their furious rush, none of them seemed to immediately register the massive pile of industrial black trash bags lining the edges of my expansive front porch. They were entirely focused on getting inside to secure the kingdom they falsely believed they owned. Andre stomped up the concrete steps and shoved his brass key into the lock. I stood completely still in the center of my marble foyer, watching him through the tall, reinforced glass panels that flanked the double doors. I watched his hand twist the key. It did not budge. He pulled it out, shoved it back in, and twisted harder. The new high-grade security lock held perfectly firm. A look of pure, unadulterated disbelief washed over his face. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and rattled it violently. When the thick door refused to yield, he lost what little composure he had left. He raised his foot and kicked the solid mahogany wood. The heavy thud echoed across the porch. "Open the door, Camille!" he screamed, his voice muffled, but entirely audible through the thick glass. "You cannot lock me out of my own house. Half of this property belongs to me. Open this door right now." Loretta hurried up the steps behind him, her eyes wide with indignation. When she realized the door was permanently sealed, she spun around and marched right back down to the center of my meticulously manicured lawn. She was a woman who worshipped at the altar of public opinion, and she immediately tried to weaponize the affluent neighborhood against me. "Help!" she shrieked, throwing her hands up toward the sky in a dramatic theatrical display. "Will somebody please help us?" She turned in a slow circle, ensuring her voice carried toward the neighboring multi-million-dollar estates. "Look at what this ungrateful woman is doing. She is locking her sick, dying husband out on the street. She is trying to murder my son. Somebody call the authorities. She is a monster." I did not flinch. I did not move to open the door to silence her. I let her scream. I let her put her absolute lack of class and decorum on full display for every wealthy doctor, lawyer, and corporate executive living on our quiet tree-lined street. Andre was still pounding his fists against the mahogany wood when his eyes finally darted downward and registered the mountain of black plastic bags sitting just feet away from him. He reached down and ripped one of the bags open. His cheap imported suits and golf shirts spilled out onto the porch. He stared at his discarded belongings, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation began to sink in. I was not just throwing a brief emotional tantrum. I was permanently removing him from the premises. Chloe stepped up onto the porch, carefully avoiding the scattered clothing. She did not yell like Loretta or kick the doors like Andre. She pulled her smartphone from her designer purse and tapped the screen with frantic precision. She held the phone to her ear and locked eyes with me through the glass. Her expression was a mix of desperate panic and spiteful triumph. "Yes, hello. I need police assistance immediately," Chloe said, her voice pitching up into a perfect performance of manufactured distress. "My brother-in-law was just discharged from the intensive care unit, and his wife has illegally locked him out of his primary residence. Yes, we are at the house right now. She threw all his belongings on the porch, and she is refusing to grant him access to his own home. He requires medical equipment that is inside. Please hurry." Chloe lowered the phone and offered me a smug, arrogant little smile. She actually thought calling the police was going to solve their problem. She thought the authorities would show up, force me to unlock the doors, and escort Andre back into the lap of luxury while scolding me for an illegal eviction. She believed the law was on their side. I did not break eye contact with her. I took another slow, deliberate sip from my glass of sparkling water. I stood perfectly straight in the center of my foyer, bathed in the warm afternoon light pouring through the high windows. Flanking me on either side were my two private security guards. They stood like absolute statues with their arms crossed over their tactical vests, their faces completely unreadable and fully prepared to intervene the second anyone tried to breach the glass. I was not afraid of the police arriving. I welcomed it. I wanted law enforcement to show up with their sirens wailing and their radios crackling. Andre, Loretta, and Chloe had spent the last hour digging their own graves on my front lawn. I was just waiting for the police to arrive so I could hand them the shovels. The distant wail of police sirens cut through the quiet hum of the wealthy neighborhood. I watched through the reinforced glass as two black and white cruisers turned onto my street. They slowed down and flashed their lights at my towering wrought iron gates. I picked up my tablet and pressed the button to open the gates, granting them full access to my driveway. This was the moment Chloe had been waiting for. She practically vibrated with excitement as the patrol cars pulled to a stop behind her silver sport utility vehicle. Before the officers even had a chance to put their cruisers in park, Chloe was already sprinting toward them. She had perfected the exact brand of frantic, breathless victimhood that always seemed to work on authority figures. She threw her hands in the air, pointing dramatically at the black trash bags on my porch and then at her husband's brother. "Officer, you have to help us," she cried, her voice echoing across the lawn. My brother-in-law was just released from the intensive care unit. Hai is critically ill, and his wife has completely lost her mind. She locked him out, threw his medical necessities on the porch, and is refusing to let him into his own house. Loretta was right beside her, playing the role of the outraged, devastated mother. She grabbed Andre by the arm and pulled him forward, making sure the officer saw his gray hospital sweatpants and the plastic admission band still wrapped around his wrist. "Look at my son," Loretta wailed. "He is dying, and that woman is trying to leave him out here on the street. Arrest her. You need to arrest her right now for an illegal eviction and domestic endangerment." Andre leaned heavily against his mother. He looked physically weak, but his eyes were bright with a smug, arrogant victory as he stared up at the house. He actually thought he had won. He puffed out his chest, looking at the two officers who were now approaching the front steps with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. "I want her removed from the premises," Andre demanded, his voice raspy but full of unearned authority. "She changed the locks on my house. I want her in handcuffs." I took one final sip of my water, set the glass down on the marble console table, and unlocked the front door. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped out onto the porch. My two private security guards immediately stepped inward, flanking me on both sides to form a physical barrier between myself and the chaotic mess on my lawn. The cool afternoon breeze caught the edges of my silk blouse, but I stood perfectly still, looking down at the three of them from the top of the concrete steps. The lead officer, a tall, burly man with a stern expression, stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Ma'am," he said, projecting his voice over Loretta's continuous shouting. "We received a call regarding an illegal lockout at this residence. This gentleman claims he lives here and that you have denied him access to his property. Do you understand that you cannot legally evict a resident without proper 30-day court notice, regardless of whatever domestic dispute you two are having?" I looked down at the officer and offered him a polite, professional smile. "Officer, I completely agree with you," I said, my voice steady and crystal clear. "It is absolutely illegal to lock a homeowner or illegal tenant out of their primary residence. However, that law only applies if the individual actually has a legal right to be on the premises." I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I had prepared this exact folder 3 years ago, the moment I realized my husband was funneling my money into his failing business ventures. I walked down 2 steps and handed the folder directly to the lead officer. "What you are holding is the official registered property deed for this estate," I explained calmly while the officer opened the file. "You will also find the finalized documents for the corporate trust and the limited liability company that holds the title to this land. You will notice that my name, Camille, is the sole registered owner of that corporate entity. This property was purchased with cash through my trust 2 full years before I ever married that man standing on my lawn." Andre's smooth expression faltered. He took a hesitant step forward away from his mother. "Camille, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping its confident edge. "We bought this house together. I picked out the property. I oversaw the renovations. You picked out the kitchen countertops, Andre." I corrected him sharply, not breaking eye contact with the police officer. "I paid the $3 million asking price." I pointed to the documents in the officer's hands. "There is no mortgage on this estate, officer. It is not marital property. Andre's name is not on the deed. He has never contributed a single cent to the property taxes, the maintenance, or the utilities. Furthermore, because he has maintained a separate registered address for his supposed real estate business downtown, he does not even qualify for standard tenant rights under state law. He is simply a guest who has overstayed his welcome." The lead officer spent a long, agonizing minute reading through the highlighted sections of the legal documents. Chloe was holding her breath. Loretta was staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned around to face Andre, and his entire demeanor had shifted from suspicious investigator to annoyed enforcer. "Sir," the officer said, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt, "according to these documents, you have absolutely no legal claim to this property. This house belongs entirely to the corporate trust managed by your wife." "That is a lie." Loretta shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "My son is a successful developer. He bought this house for her. She is forging those papers." The officer glared at Loretta. "Ma'am, these are officially notarized county records. If you continue to yell at me, I will cite you for disturbing the peace." He turned his attention back to Andre, who was now visibly shaking. "Sir, you need to gather your belongings from this porch and vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse to leave, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." The absolute silence that fell over my front lawn was deafening. Chloe's jaw actually dropped open. The sweet innocent victim act she had tried to play for the police had completely backfired. She had called the authorities thinking they would be her personal attack dogs, only to have them confirm that her ticket to a mortgage-free life was actually completely broke and currently homeless. Andre stared up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The entire illusion of his wealthy, successful life was being dismantled right in front of his mother, his mistress, and the local police department. "But I live here," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic plea. "Camille, please, I am sick. Where am I supposed to go?" I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "I do not care where you go, Andre," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "You can go sleep in your failing rented office space. You can go sleep in the hospital waiting room. Or better yet, you can go move into Chloe's house. I hear she is going to need some help paying her mortgage anyway." Chloe let out a strangled gasp and took a rapid step back toward her vehicle, as if trying to distance herself from the burning wreckage of Andre's life. The lead officer stepped forward, resting his hand on his radio. "Sir, I am not going to tell you again. Grab your bags and get off this property." Loretta looked like she was going to faint. The wealthy neighbors she had been trying to perform for were now standing on their immaculate porches, watching her golden child being treated like a common vagrant. She grabbed Andre's arm, crying genuine tears of profound humiliation as she helped him pick up the heavy black trash bags filled with his cheap wrinkled suits. Chloe did not help them. She practically sprinted back to the driver's seat of her car, slamming the door shut. She watched with wide, terrified eyes as Andre and Loretta dragged the trash bags across my pristine driveway and shoved them into the back seat of her vehicle. I stood on the porch flanked by my security team and watched the three of them pack into the car like defeated refugees. The police cruiser flashed its lights, a final warning for them to move. Chloe put the car into reverse and sped down the driveway, her tires squealing as she turned out of the gate and drove away in absolute disgrace. I turned around and walked back into my quiet, beautiful home. The first major battle was won, but I knew the war was far from over. Andre was a desperate man with nothing left to lose, and desperate men always try to make a scene when the spotlight is on. I just needed to make sure that when he finally stepped onto the stage, the entire world would be watching him fall. The next 7 days inside my home were the most profoundly peaceful I had experienced in a decade. There was no more walking on eggshells to protect a fragile male ego. There was no more forcing a smile while listening to elaborate lies about phantom commercial real estate deals. There was just the quiet, immaculate sanctuary of the estate I had paid for with my own brilliance and sweat. My private security team maintained a flawless perimeter outside, and for the first time in my adult life, I breathed completely free air. The physical world was perfectly quiet, but my digital world was an absolute war zone. I had blocked Andre and his family on all communication platforms, but I routed their calls to a secure voicemail box monitored by my legal team. Every evening, I sat in my home office with a glass of red wine and listened to the audio files. The progression of Andre's voicemails was a masterclass in narcissistic collapse. On day 1, he was furious. He screamed into the receiver, threatening to sue me for everything I owned, demanding I let him back into his house, and promising to ruin my reputation in Atlanta. By day 3, the reality of his self-pay medical status had clearly set in. The fury dissolved into pathetic bargaining. He offered to completely cut off his brother's wife if I would just reinstate his premium insurance. He swore the text message was a moment of weakness and that Chloe had manipulated him. I was willing to throw his own mistress under the bus the second his life depended on it. By day 5, the bargaining turned into sheer desperation. His voice was incredibly weak, likely from the rapid decline of his renal function. I was crying, begging me to remember our wedding vows. He pleaded for my kidney, telling me he was going to die in a public ward without my help. Not once in any of those 37 voicemails did he actually apologize for trying to orchestrate my financial ruin. He was only sorry he got caught before he could finish the job. Loretta left voicemails too. Hers were dripping with toxic religious manipulation. She left long, drawn-out messages claiming the pastor at her prominent megachurch was praying for my wicked soul. She accused me of turning my back on my community and abandoning a dying black man. She tried to leverage the heavy cultural expectation that a strong woman must carry the weight of her family no matter how deeply they betray her. She thought she could shame me into submission. She did not realize that guilt only works on people who still care about your opinion. Chloe, on the other hand, was completely silent. After her white tears failed to move the police officers on my front lawn, she had seemingly vanished into thin air. I knew exactly why. Without my money to bail them out, Terrence was undoubtedly dismantling their marriage, and Chloe was staring down the barrel of a massive mortgage she could not afford. She was busy fighting her own fires. I let them leave their desperate messages, but my focus was entirely on the upcoming weekend. For months, I had been scheduled to receive the Innovator of the Year award at the annual Black Excellence in Business Gala. It was the most prestigious corporate event in the city. The guest list included local politicians, millionaire entrepreneurs, and the most influential media personalities in the state. It was exactly the kind of high society event Loretta had spent her entire life trying to infiltrate. She had always used my invitations to these galas to parade Andre around, making him look like a wealthy power player to her church friends. I knew how these people operated. Andre was rapidly running out of time and medical options. Loretta was running out of social currency. They were desperate, and desperate people crave an audience. I knew with absolute certainty that they would try to crash the gala. They would use the massive public platform to corner me. They assumed I would be terrified of a public scandal. In their minds, I was a public relations expert who protected corporate images for a living, so I would naturally do anything to avoid a messy domestic dispute in front of Atlanta's elite. They thought I would quietly agree to pay his medical bills and give him the kidney just to make a public scene go away. They fundamentally misunderstood what I do for a living. In crisis management, the person who controls the narrative controls reality. You do not hide from a public scandal. You meticulously engineer the scandal to destroy your opponent while keeping your own hands perfectly clean. I drove to my corporate office downtown and locked myself in the boardroom with my lead forensic accountant. I told him to pull every single trace of Andre's financial history. I gave him full access to the joint accounts I had already frozen and the business ledgers Andre thought he had hidden. What my accountant uncovered in just 48 hours was worse than I had even imagined. Andre was not just a failing businessman. He was a spectacular liability. The audits proved that he had not made a single legitimate real estate sale in 4 years. More importantly, they revealed exactly where my money had been going. There were routine, massive transfers to Chloe's personal checking account, disguised as vendor payments. But the most damning discovery was a staggering debt of $350,000 owed to a group of highly dangerous private lenders. Andre had taken out predatory loans to fund his fake luxury lifestyle, and the collectors were actively closing in on him. I was drowning in debt. That was why they needed my life insurance and my business assets so badly. They were not just greedy. They were trying to save Andre from the people he owed money to. I took the financial reports, the bank statements highlighting the transfers to Chloe and the brutal records of his private debts. I did not hand them over to a lawyer just yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the sleek professional slideshow presentation I had prepared for my award acceptance speech. The original presentation highlighted my firm's community outreach programs and our successful corporate campaigns. I deleted the final 3 slides. In their place, I uploaded high-resolution images of Andre's catastrophic financial audits. I highlighted the massive debts in bright red. I uploaded the screenshot of Chloe's text message plotting my financial ruin. I embedded the audio file of a voicemail where Andre admitted to funneling money behind my back. I seamlessly integrated his absolute destruction into my professional presentation. I handed the encrypted flash drive directly to the gala's audiovisual director, whom I had worked with for years. I told him there had been a slight update to my acceptance speech and instructed him to leave the final slides on the massive ballroom screens until I explicitly gave him the signal to cut the feed. Saturday evening arrived with a cool, crisp breeze. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my master bedroom and inspected my reflection. I wore a custom emerald green evening gown that draped perfectly over my figure. My hair was styled in flawless locks swept elegantly over one shoulder. My makeup was sharp, precise, and unyielding. I did not look like a heartbroken wife mourning the end of a 10-year marriage. I looked like a woman preparing to walk into a battlefield and emerge without a single scratch. I slipped my diamond tennis bracelet onto my wrist and grabbed my evening clutch. The private car was already waiting at the bottom of my driveway. I knew Andre and Loretta were out there somewhere, preparing their tears, preparing their victim speeches, preparing to leverage the culture of our community to force me into submission. They thought they were walking into a charity event to publicly shame a selfish woman. They had no idea they were walking directly into an execution. The private car pulled up to the grand entrance of the downtown Atlanta luxury hotel. I stepped out into the warm evening air, letting the rapid flash of press cameras wash over my emerald green silk gown. The Black Excellence in Business Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the corporate social season. The massive ballroom was an absolute vision of opulence and high society. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over dozens of perfectly arranged tables adorned with white orchids. The room was filled with the most influential African-American politicians, millionaire entrepreneurs, and media mogul in the state. I took my seat at the center VIP table right near the front of the stage. I smiled and exchanged pleasantries with city council members and corporate executives who had become my close friends over the years. Outwardly, I was a picture of grace and untroubled success. Inwardly, my pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat preparing for war. I knew exactly what was coming. I had handed my encrypted flash drive to the audiovisual director the moment I walked through the service doors. My trap was perfectly set. All I needed was for my prey to step onto the stage. After an hour of a lavish dinner and opening remarks, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the main podium. His deep voice boomed through the massive speaker system, praising my crisis management firm for its outstanding community outreach programs and unparalleled corporate integrity. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause when he announced my name for the Innovator of the Year award. I stood up, smoothing the heavy silk of my gown, and began making my way up the carpeted stairs toward the brightly lit stage. That was when the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom were violently shoved open. The loud, aggressive thud echoed completely over the applause, causing hundreds of heads to turn in confusion. I stopped at the edge of the stage and looked back over the crowd. Andre and Loretta were physically pushing their way through the bewildered guests and frantic event staff. Andre had completely abandoned any remaining shred of his former pride. He was wearing a cheap wrinkled suit that hung loosely and awkwardly off his frame. It was clearly something he had bought off a discount rack since I had trashed his entire custom wardrobe in industrial garbage, leaning heavily on a thick wooden cane, dragging his left foot with a dramatic, exaggerated limp. He had intentionally made himself look as sickly, unkempt, and pathetic as humanly possible to garner maximum sympathy from the wealthy crowd. His face was pale, his eyes were wide, and he was visibly trembling as he forced his way down the center aisle. Loretta marched right beside him, holding his arm and playing the role of the devastated, fiercely protective mother. She was wearing a conservative dark church suit, pushing past the elite guests with a look of righteous manufactured indignation. 4 security guards rushed forward down the aisle to intercept them, but Andre raised his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. He shouted at the top of his lungs that he was my husband, that he was a dying man, and that he just needed 1 single minute to speak to his wife before his body gave out. The guards hesitated, unsure of how to handle a severe medical crisis at a high society charity event. That brief moment of human hesitation was all Andre needed. He hobbled past the guards and rushed up the side stairs of the stage. He moved with surprising speed for a man claiming to be on his absolute deathbed. I stood perfectly still near the center podium watching him approach. I did not shrink back. I did not show an ounce of fear or embarrassment. Andre shoved past the master of ceremonies and grabbed the main microphone right off the stand. A loud screech of audio feedback pierced the room, silencing the entire ballroom instantly. 500 of Atlanta's most powerful people stared in absolute shock as my uninvited husband gripped the microphone with both hands. "Please," Andre begged, his voice cracking perfectly as it echoed through the massive speakers overhead. "I know I am interrupting a beautiful night, but I am a desperate man. I am running out of time, and the woman you are honoring tonight is the only human being on earth who can save me." He turned to look at me, tears streaming rapidly down his face. He put on the performance of a lifetime. He played the role of the devoted, heartbroken black man who had been ruthlessly cast aside by a greedy corporate woman. "I supported her when she had absolutely nothing," Andre cried out, scanning the silent crowd with desperate eyes. "I held her hand while she built this incredible empire. I gave her my heart and my soul. But 2 weeks ago, my kidneys started failing. I am dying. And the moment I got sick, the moment I needed my wife to stand by me the way I stood by her, she walked right out of the hospital and locked me out of our home." Loud gasps rippled through the audience. Wealthy socialites whispered behind their hands in sheer horror. Corporate investors and politicians stared at me with wide, deeply judgmental eyes. The narrative he was spinning was culturally devastating, and he knew it. Andre leaned heavily on his wooden cane, his voice breaking into a loud, pathetic sob. "She thinks she is too good for her own people now that she has a little money. She thinks her fancy corporate contracts are more important than the sacred vows we made before God. She abandoned a dying man on his hospital bed just so she would not have to inconvenience her busy schedule. She threw me out on the street like garbage." Right on cue, Loretta stepped up to the very front of the stage, standing right below the podium. She raised her hands toward the ceiling, her voice ringing out through the quiet room like a furious fire and brimstone preacher holding court. "Tell the truth," Loretta shouted, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "Tell the truth, Lord. Have mercy on this wicked woman. Amen. She is turning her back on her community. She is leaving her own husband to die like a dog. You people are giving an award to a monster." Loretta turned around to face the crowd, using every ounce of cultural manipulation she had stored up over a lifetime. She was actively trying to leverage the toxic expectation that a strong black woman must always carry the crushing burden of a broken man. She wanted to publicly shame me into complete submission. She wanted to humiliate me in front of my peers, my clients, and my community so thoroughly that I would be forced to take him back and donate my organ just to save my public relations firm from a massive, unreoverable scandal. Andre reached out and tried to grab my hand, holding the microphone near his mouth. "Camille, please," he begged, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Just come home. Give me the kidney. Save my life. I forgive you for abandoning me. Just be a real wife and save your family." The silence in the room was entirely suffocating. 500 people were holding their breath, waiting to see how the brilliant crisis manager would handle the complete public destruction of her personal and professional reputation. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to cover my face, run crying off the stage, or snatch the microphone and start screaming defensive, frantic excuses. I did none of those things. I stood there bathed in the bright stage lights, and I let Andre finish his pathetic little performance. I let Loretta scream her fake religious outrage until she was literally gasping for breath. I gave them enough rope to hang themselves completely and irrevocably in front of the entire city. I slowly pulled my hand away from Andre's grasp. I stepped up to the podium, leaning toward the second microphone that the stunned master of ceremonies had left behind on the table. I did not look at my husband. I looked directly out into the sea of shocked, judgmental faces. Then I raised my hand and signaled the audiovisual director in the back booth. It was time to show Atlanta exactly who the real monster was. I stood at the acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of faces. 500 of the most influential people in Atlanta were staring up at me, completely paralyzed by the spectacle that had just unfolded. They were waiting for a reaction. They were waiting for me to break down in tears, to flee the stage in humiliation, or to snatch the microphone and start screaming defensive, frantic excuses. That is what people expect when a woman is publicly humiliated by her husband. They expect her to crumble under the heavy weight of social pressure and cultural expectation. But I did not feel humiliated. I felt a cold, absolute focus. I looked at Andre, who was panting slightly, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, playing the fragile victim. I looked at Loretta, who was still standing at the edge of the stage, with her arms crossed, looking up at me with pure venom after her fake religious outburst. I reached into my evening clutch and pulled out my digital tablet. I connected the cable to the media port built directly into the podium. I looked to the back of the massive ballroom and caught the eye of the audiovisual director sitting in the control booth. I gave him a single sharp nod. The massive, high-defined screens flanking the stage flickered. The elegant gold logo for the Black Excellence in Business Gala vanished instantly. In its place, a crisp, stark document appeared illuminated for the entire room to see. It was a certified forensic financial audit of Andre's real estate development company. "My husband just told you a very compelling story," I said. My voice was smooth, perfectly amplified by the microphone carrying across the room without a single tremor. "He told you that he supported me while I built my empire and that I abandoned him in his time of need because I felt I was too good for my own people. It is a beautiful narrative, Loretta, but it is a complete and utter fabrication." I tapped the screen on my tablet. The slide transitioned on the massive screens behind me, zooming in on specific line items. Andre likes to present himself to this community as a highly successful commercial real estate developer. I continued addressing the silent, breathless ballroom. But as you can see from these certified financial records, Andre has not closed a single legitimate business deal in over 4 years. His development company is an empty shell. In fact, the only revenue keeping his business accounts open has been the thousands of dollars I quietly transferred to him every single month just to protect his pride. Low murmurs began to ripple through the wealthy crowd. Bankers, investors, and corporate executives in the audience recognized the tax forms and audit spreadsheets on the screen. They knew exactly what they were looking at. The numbers did not lie. Andre took a startled step back, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He tried to reach for the microphone again, but I smoothly stepped to the side, keeping the heavy acrylic podium firmly between us. I tapped the screen again. Bold red numbers highlighted a new section of the audit. "Andre did not just fail at business," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "He became reckless. Right now, the man standing on this stage playing the victim is currently $350,000 in debt, and he does not owe that money to any legitimate bank sitting in this room tonight. He owes that massive sum to a group of highly dangerous private lenders operating in the shadows of this city, predators who are actively coming to collect." Loretta lowered her arms. Her mouth fell open. She looked up at the giant screen and then looked at her golden child. "Andre, what is she talking about?" Loretta whispered loudly enough for the front rows to hear. Andre could not speak. He was staring at the projector screen in absolute horror as his fake, luxurious life was dismantled piece by piece in front of the exact high society crowd he had spent years trying to impress. "But wait," I said, cutting through the rising, shocked whispers in the ballroom. "It gets much worse." I tapped the screen a third time. Official bank transfer receipts appeared side by side. They clearly showed monthly payments originating from my corporate accounts, moving through Andre's business shell, and depositing directly into a residential mortgage account. While I was working 80-hour weeks to fund our life, Andre was funneling my hard-earned money behind my back, I explained, tracking the flow of funds with a digital laser pointer. He was not paying off his dangerous debts. He was paying the monthly mortgage on a house located in the suburbs, a house owned by a woman named Chloe. I paused, letting the name hang in the heavy air. "For those of you who do not know our family tree, Chloe is not a business partner," I continued. "Chloe is a white woman who happens to be married to Andre's older brother, Terrence." The collective gasp from the audience was loud and undeniable. Several women in the front row actually covered their mouths in sheer disbelief. Cheating on your successful wife was bad enough in these circles. Embezzling her money to pay for a house belonging to your own brother's wife was a level of betrayal that completely shocked the elite crowd. The room erupted into fierce, hushed conversations. The respect and sympathy Andre had commanded just moments ago vanished, evaporating into pure disgust. Andre dropped his wooden cane. It clattered loudly against the polished stage floor. The pathetic, dramatic limp he had been faking all evening disappeared instantly. He stood up perfectly straight, sweat beading on his forehead. "Camille, stop," he begged, stepping toward the podium with his hands raised. "Please turn that off. You are ruining me." I did not turn it off. I looked him dead in the eyes and tapped the screen one last time. The financial documents vanished. They were replaced by a massive, high-defined screenshot of the text message I had found on his phone in the pre-op room. The words were magnified so large that even the people sitting at the very back tables could read them perfectly. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in a hospital gown at Emory University Hospital. I told the crowd, my voice dropping to a low, fierce register that demanded absolute attention. I had an IV in my arm. I was 30 minutes away from going under a general anesthesia to donate my left kidney to save this man's life. And then a notification popped up on his phone. It was from his brother's wife. I turned my body and pointed directly at the giant screen behind me. Just get her kidney and sign the divorce papers. I read aloud, my voice carrying the full weight of the betrayal. Then we can finally pay off my house. Love you, baby. Loretta stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the stage to keep from collapsing. The religious outrage she had performed just moments earlier was entirely gone, replaced by profound public humiliation. The church friends she had brought as guests were staring at her with wide, appalled eyes. Her perfect son was a fraud, a thief, and a traitor to his own blood brother. I turned back to the audience. The entire room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. My husband and his mistress were not just waiting for me to hand over a vital organ so they could run off together. I said the absolute truth, cutting through the beautiful ballroom like a surgeon's scalpel. Andre is drowning in a dangerous $350,000 debt. He knew that even if he divorced me, the courts would not give him access to my corporate trust. But he also knew the risks of transplant surgery. I knew that if I somehow died on that operating table or suffered severe complications, he would be the sole beneficiary of my massive executive life insurance policy. I gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, leaning into the microphone. I looked down at Andre, who was now trembling uncontrollably, his fake world completely burned to ashes. My husband did not just want my kidney, I told the dead silent ballroom. He wanted my life insurance. The crowd gasped. It was a sharp, collective intake of breath that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The sheer, calculated evil of what Andre had planned finally settled over the room. He had not just come here to shame me, he had come here to manipulate the very community I served, hoping they would pressure me back into a lethal trap. I stood tall in my emerald gown, bathed in the bright stage lights, entirely untouchable. I had not just defended my reputation, I had completely obliterated his. The suffocating silence in the ballroom shattered all at once. It did not break with a polite murmur, but with a loud, collective wave of absolute disgust. The elite Black business community of Atlanta is built on networks of mutual respect, deep loyalty, and shared excellence. To stand in front of this specific crowd, an attempt to weaponize our cultural values to cover up theft, infidelity, and applauded insurance payout was a profound insult. The audience turned on him instantly. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos shook their heads in open contempt. Women in evening gowns actively pulled out their smartphones, pointing the glowing camera lenses directly at the stage to record the absolute destruction of a fraud. The sympathy that Andre had managed to manipulate just minutes prior was entirely gone. In its place was a fierce, protective anger directed entirely at him. Andre stood at the edge of the stage, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He raised the microphone to his mouth, trying to stammer out an excuse, trying to claim the documents on the screen were forged, but his voice completely failed him. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life surviving on charm and borrowed money. Now his charm was useless, and his debts were projected in high definition for the most powerful investors in the state to see. The reality of his $350,000 debt to dangerous private lenders was no longer a secret. His creditors would know exactly how broke he truly was by tomorrow morning. Down in the front row, Loretta was experiencing her own personal nightmare. She had invited 3 prominent women from her megachurch to sit at her table, aiming to show off her successful son and her high society connections. I watched as those 3 women stood up from their chairs, picked up their evening bags, and walked away from the table without saying a single word to her. Loretta realized in that exact moment that her social currency in Atlanta was permanently bankrupt. The church community she worshiped would never let her live down the shame of a son who embezzled from his Black wife to pay the mortgage of his brother's white wife. Loretta let out a strange, panicked whimpering sound. She raised her designer clutch to her face, desperately trying to block the bright flashes of cell phone cameras capturing her humiliation. She turned her back to the stage and tried to push her way through the crowd toward the exit, but the guests did not politely step aside for her. They stood their ground, forcing her to squeeze humiliatingly through the tight spaces between their tables. The event coordinator standing in the wings finally gave the signal. 4 massive event security guards in dark suits marched down the center aisle and straight up the stage stairs. They did not approach with the gentle caution they had shown earlier. They moved with swift, uncompromising authority. Two of the guards flanked Andre, grabbing him firmly by both arms. Andre did not fight them. All the fight had been drained out of him the moment I exposed his life insurance plot. His hands began to shake violently, and his fingers went completely slack. The microphone slipped from his grasp and hit the polished wooden stage floor with a loud, sharp electronic pop that echoed through the speaker system. Hai did not even look at me as the guards marched him down the side stairs. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, dragging his feet as they escorted him toward the service exit. A third guard intercepted Loretta near the back of the room, grabbing her by the elbow and marching her out the same doors. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing them out of the kingdom they had tried so hard to conquer. The ballroom was buzzing with fierce, agitated energy. The master of ceremonies, a seasoned media veteran, stepped back up to the main podium. He looked slightly shaken, but quickly adjusted his tuxedo jacket and regained his professional composure. He picked up the dropped microphone from the floor and placed it back on the stand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his deep voice smoothing over the chaotic energy in the room. "We are here tonight to celebrate resilience, brilliant strategy, and undeniable excellence. I cannot think of a better demonstration of those exact qualities than what we just witnessed." He turned toward me and extended his hand. "Please join me in welcoming our Innovator of the Year." I stepped out from behind my acrylic podium and walked to the center of the stage. The massive projector screen behind me flickered and the harsh financial audits vanished, replaced once again by the elegant gold logo of my public relations firm. The lighting shifted, bathing me in a warm golden glow. I took the heavy crystal award from the presenter and approached the main microphone. I looked out at the sea of faces. They were no longer looking at me with judgment or pity. They were looking at me with profound respect. True innovation is not just about building a successful company. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the massive room. True innovation is about having the courage to audit your own life. It is about identifying the rot, cutting out the liabilities, and refusing to apologize for protecting your peace and your assets. I paused, letting the words resonate with the hundreds of business owners and executives who understood exactly what it took to protect an empire. For too long, many of us have been told that our success must be compromised to accommodate the insecurities of those who refuse to build their own foundations. I continued, "We are taught to shrink our light so we do not blind the people who belong in the dark. Tonight, I am accepting this award not just for my firm, but for every woman in this room who has ever funded a fake kingdom just to keep the peace. Stop shrinking, stop funding your own disrespect. Protect your brilliance and let the liabilities evict themselves." The response was instantaneous and entirely overwhelming. A woman in the front row stood up and began clapping. Then a table of executives stood up. Within 10 seconds, all 500 guests in the grand ballroom were on their feet. The standing ovation thundered through the venue, a roaring wave of validation and absolute victory. I stood center stage holding my crystal award and allowed myself to simply bask in the triumph. I had walked into an ambush designed to destroy me, and I had turned it into the crowning moment of my professional career. When the gala finally concluded, I was escorted to my waiting car through a private side exit, avoiding the aggressive swarm of local media and society bloggers. Eager for a statement, I settled into the plush leather seat of the town car and set my award on the seat beside me. The city lights of Atlanta blurred past my window as we drove back toward my secured estate in Buckhead. I pulled my phone from my clutch and opened my messages. My crisis management team was already sending me updates. The video of my presentation, including the massive projected text message and the financial audit, was already circulating across every major social media platform in the city. Andre was completely ruined in the court of public opinion. He could never show his face in a respectable business setting in this state again. But as I watched the streetlights fade into the quiet, tree-lined roads of my neighborhood, my sharp focus returned. I knew the psychology of a corner. Desperate man. Andre was sick, his kidneys were failing, and he was drowning in a $350,000 debt to dangerous people who did not care about social scandals. The public shaming had stripped away his pride, but it would only amplify his desperation. He had lost his health insurance. He had lost his fake reputation. He had lost his access to my bank accounts. But he was legally still my husband, and he still believed the court system would view him as a vulnerable sick spouse entitled to half of my marital assets. He still had Chloe whispering in his ear, desperate to save her own home from foreclosure. They were going to stop trying to manipulate me in public, and they were going to come for me in the courtroom. They were going to demand emergency spousal support, forced medical coverage, and a massive division of my corporate assets. They thought a judge would look at a dying man and force me to empty my pockets to save him. I leaned my head back against the cool leather seat and smiled into the darkness of the car. Let them sue me. Let them hire the most aggressive, sleazy divorce lawyer they could find. Let them drag themselves into a courtroom thinking they were finally going to get their hands on my money. They were walking straight into the final trap, and I already had the absolute perfect weapon waiting for them. 2 weeks passed in a state of hyper-focused preparation. The absolute silence from Andre and his mother was not a sign of their surrender. It was the predictable quiet that always precedes a desperate attack. I spent those 14 days throwing myself entirely into my crisis management firm. I secured new corporate contracts and expanded my team completely unbothered by the ghost of my failed marriage. But I kept my legal counsel on speed dial because I knew the reality of Andre's medical situation. Without my premium executive health insurance, he had been immediately downgraded to a standard care facility. He had been stripped of his priority status on the private transplant wait list. The mounting daily costs of his specialized intensive care were piling up rapidly. His dangerous private creditors were undoubtedly breathing down his neck, demanding the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had recklessly borrowed. He was a man completely out of time and out of options. I was sitting in my corner office overlooking the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta when my receptionist walked in holding a thick manila envelope. A process server had just dropped it off at the front desk. I thanked her, closed my office door, and broke the seal on the envelope. I pulled out a massive stack of formal legal documents. Andre was suing me. He had managed to find a predatory attorney willing to take his case on contingency, hoping for a massive payout. I sat back in my leather chair and read through the demands. The sheer audacity of his lawsuit was almost breathtaking in its delusion. I had filed an emergency petition for temporary spousal support, claiming he was entirely destitute and physically incapacitated due to my sudden and cruel abandonment. He demanded a court order that would force me to immediately reinstate him on my corporate health insurance policy. He requested a mandatory injunction requiring me to pay for his private medical care out of pocket, including the astronomical costs of a future kidney transplant and all subsequent anti-rejection medications. But the absolute height of his arrogance was buried in the property division requests. Andre was demanding exactly 50% of my public relations and crisis management firm. His sleazy lawyer had drafted a completely fabricated narrative claiming that Andre was an instrumental silent partner who had provided essential business advice and emotional support while I built my empire. He claimed my corporate assets were marital property, and he demanded immediate access to my business accounts to cover his legal fees and living expenses. I was trying to use the family court system to legally rob me blind. He wanted a judge to look at a sick, dying man and force the wealthy, successful wife to open her checkbook out of moral obligation. He thought he could manipulate the law exactly the way his mother manipulated her church congregation. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear over the legal threats. I picked up my phone and called my lead attorney, instructing him to prepare our response. We did not need to scramble or build a complicated defense. I had spent years quietly and methodically protecting my assets from a man I knew deep down was a financial liability. We were more than ready for this fight. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with a thick, humid heat settling over the city. I dressed with absolute precision. I did not wear the subdued, sympathetic colors of a grieving wife. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp white blouse and simple pearl earrings. I wore my hair pulled back sharply. I wanted to walk into that courtroom looking exactly like the formidable chief executive officer that I was. I arrived at the Fulton County Courthouse, flanked by my lead attorney and my financial auditor. The polished marble floors of the courthouse echoed with the sounds of lawyers negotiating and families arguing, but I kept my focus locked straight ahead. We navigated through the security checkpoints and rode the crowded elevator up to the family court division. When we pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked into the assigned courtroom, the space was mostly empty. The judge had not yet taken the bench, but there was one very familiar face sitting alone in the back row of the wooden gallery benches. It was Chloe. I stopped for a brief moment and simply observed her from across the room. She looked absolutely nothing like the smug, arrogant woman who had stood in the hospital corridor and threatened to take half of my business. The polished, pristine image she always projected had completely shattered. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her expensive designer clothes looked unwashed and rumpled. She was anxiously bouncing her knee and chewing on her thumbnail, looking pale and entirely frantic. My private investigator had given me a full update on her situation just days prior. Terrence had made good on the promise he made in the hospital hallway the moment he discovered his wife was plotting to pay off their mortgage by sleeping with his brother and stealing my assets. He packed his bags and walked out. He filed for divorce the very next morning and completely cut off her access to his income. Without Terrence paying her bills and without the massive financial payout she had expected Andre to extract from my bank accounts, Chloe was financially drowning. Her house was actively slipping into foreclosure. She had no job, no savings, and no wealthy husband to bail her out. She was sitting in that courtroom gallery because she was a parasite desperately waiting for a host. She needed Andre to win this emergency injunction. She was banking her entire financial survival on a judge, forcing me to hand over millions of dollars to Andre so he could funnel a portion of it to her. She looked up and met my eyes across the courtroom. I did not glare at her. I offered her a slow, chilling smile. She immediately dropped her gaze and shrank down into the wooden bench, staring at her lap in pure shame. A few minutes later, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. I turned around and watched my arranged husband make his grand entrance. Andre was no longer walking with a wooden cane. He was sitting in a hospital transport wheelchair, being pushed down the center aisle by a stern L-looking legal assistant. Loretta walked right beside the wheelchair, hovering over him like a protective hawk. She was wearing a conservative, dark, modest dress, clearly attempting to project an image of quiet, suffering dignity for the judge. Andre looked terrible. The reality of standard medical care had taken a severe toll on his body. His skin was gray and he looked gaunt and exhausted. He had a nasal cannula hooked up to a small portable oxygen tank, resting at the base of his wheelchair. He was playing the role of the frail, dying victim to absolute perfection. But the moment his wheelchair pulled up to the plaintiff table across the aisle from me, his physical frailty vanished. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. His eyes were burning with a greedy, vindictive energy. He looked at my tailored suit and my calm, unbothered posture with pure hatred. He still believed he was the smartest person in the room. He actually believed he was going to manipulate the legal system into handing him the keys to my kingdom. His sleazy lawyer, a man with a cheap suit and a predatory grin, leaned down and whispered something into Andre's ear. Andre nodded a smug, arrogant smirk, slowly creeping onto his pale face. He glanced back at Chloe in the gallery, giving her a subtle, reassuring nod. They were still working together. They were still plotting to divide my wealth between them. Loretta took a seat in the front row, right behind Andre. She glared at me, her eyes narrowed in absolute contempt. She was ready to watch the court system punish the independent black woman who had dared to stop funding her precious golden child. I sat down at the defense table and smoothed the fabric of my charcoal trousers. My lead attorney sat beside me, placing a single thin manila folder on the table between us. I did not feel an ounce of fear or anxiety. I looked at Andre sitting in his wheelchair looking so confident in his fabricated lawsuit. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and he had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on his entire existence. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom had barely swung shut before Andre's attorney stood up to begin his performance. I was a slick, fast-talking man who wore too much cologne and a suit that looked expensive but fit poorly. He immediately paced out to the center of the floor, buttoning his jacket with a dramatic flourish. He did not look at the judge right away. He looked directly at the gallery, making sure he had the full attention of the room before launching into a narrative so entirely fabricated it bordered on science fiction. Your Honor, we are here today because a devoted husband, a man who sacrificed his own dreams to build his family, is currently fighting for his life while his wife attempts to legally and financially erase him from existence. The lawyer began, his voice echoing loudly across the high ceilings. He gestured dramatically toward Andre, who was slumped down in his transport wheelchair, perfectly playing the role of a broken, discarded man. For 10 years, my client Andre served as the emotional and structural foundation of this marriage. The attorney continued pacing slowly in front of the plaintiff table, while his wife Camille traveled the country building her highly lucrative public relations empire. Andre intentionally took a step back in his own commercial real estate career. He maintained their household. He provided the essential business counsel and unwavering domestic support that allowed her company to flourish into a multi-million-dollar entity. He was, for all intents and purposes, her silent partner. I sat at the defense table and had to actively suppress a laugh. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Andre had never maintained our household. We had a full-time housekeeper, a landscaping service, and a private chef, all paid for exclusively by my corporate accounts. The only thing Andre had maintained in our 10-year marriage was a secret channel of my money flowing directly into his brother's wife's bank account. But the lawyer was just getting started. He turned his attention to the events at the hospital, twisting reality until it was completely unrecognizable. And how was my client repaid for a decade of unwavering loyalty? His lawyer demanded, his voice rising in manufactured outrage. 2 weeks ago, my client experienced catastrophic renal failure. He was lying in a hospital bed, heavily sedated and preparing to receive a life-saving organ transplant from his wife. But instead of honoring her marital vows, Camille orchestrated a malicious and calculated abandonment. In a moment of sheer greed, she realized that his medical recovery would be expensive. She realized that if he survived, she would have to share her growing wealth. So, she walked out of the intensive care unit, canceled the transplant, and maliciously removed him from her premium executive health insurance policy, leaving a dying man to fend for himself. Loretta, sitting right behind Andre, pulled a lace handkerchief from her purse and dabbed at her dry eyes. She nodded her head righteously, murmuring a soft amen, just loud enough for the court reporter to hear. She was eating up every single word of this fabricated tragedy. The lawyer then moved in for the absolute kill, outlining the emergency demands that had brought us into this courtroom. He pointed directly at the small portable oxygen tank resting at the base of Andre's wheelchair. He weaponized my husband's illness with ruthless precision. He demanded that the judge issue a mandatory injunction forcing me to immediately reinstate Andre on my top-tier corporate health insurance. High demanded an emergency monthly spousal support stipend of $40,000, claiming it was the absolute minimum required to cover Andre's out-of-pocket private medical care and anti-rejection medications. But he did not stop at the medical expenses. He went straight for my empire. Because this business was built during the course of their marriage, utilizing my client's emotional labor and domestic sacrifices, we are petitioning the court for an immediate 50% division of all corporate assets. The lawyer announced, his greedy eyes briefly locking onto mine. We demand immediate access to all of Camille's business accounts to secure my client's living expenses and cover his mounting legal fees. It is only fair and equitable, Your Honor. She cannot be allowed to build a kingdom on a man's back and then throw him out into the cold when his health fails. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the lawyer and looked toward the back of the courtroom gallery. Chloe was leaning so far forward on the hard wooden bench, she was practically sliding off of it. Her eyes were wide and her breathing was shallow. I could practically see the frantic math happening in her head. She was desperately calculating exactly how much of that proposed 50% corporate split Andre would need to funnel to her to save her house from imminent foreclosure. She needed this judge to validate this ridiculous lawsuit. Her entire financial survival depended on my destruction. I did not react. When Black women are publicly attacked, our society expects a very specific response. We are expected to get loud. We are expected to scramble to defend ourselves, to show our anger, and let our emotions spill out so they can immediately label us as aggressive and unhinged. They wanted me to interrupt that lawyer. They wanted me to stand up and shout about the betrayal so the judge would view me as a hostile, bitter wife who was acting out of pure spite. I gave them absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still in my tailored charcoal suit. I did not roll my eyes. I did not scoff. I did not shake my head in disbelief. I was the absolute picture of cold, unbothered corporate detachment. I looked down at my left wrist. I was wearing a solid gold luxury timepiece I had purchased for myself in Paris. After closing my very first 7-figure public relations contract, I slowly traced the edge of the smooth glass face. Checking the time, I let the silence of my response completely fill the room. My profound lack of reaction began to visibly unnerve the opposing counsel. He had expected to rattle me. He had expected to throw me off balance with the sheer weight of his ridiculous financial demands and his brutal character assassination. When he looked at me and saw absolutely zero fear, his confident pacing slowed down. His grandiose, theatrical hand gestures became slightly stiff. He concluded his dramatic plea with a final hollow statement about marital duty and human decency. He walked back to the plaintiff table and sat down, patting Andre on the shoulder. Andre gave a weak, shaky nod to the judge, playing the part of the frail, exhausted martyr who just wanted his fair share. The courtroom fell totally silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the central air conditioning unit and the faint scratching of the court reporter typing on her machine. The judge looked down from her high wooden bench. She folded her hands, resting them on top of her thick stack of case files. She looked at the plaintiff table, absorbing the theatrical display of the sick man and the slick lawyer. Then she turned her steady, piercing gaze across the aisle toward my side of the room. She looked at my perfectly calm posture. She looked at my lead attorney, who was sitting right beside me, looking just as bored and unbothered as I was. "Does the defense have a rebuttal to this emergency petition?" the judge asked, her voice echoing through the quiet space. My lead attorney did not yell objection. He did not launch into a passionate monologue defending my character. He simply stood up, brushed a microscopic piece of lint off his custom-tailored suit jacket, and picked up the single thin manila folder resting on our table. My lead attorney stepped out from behind our defense table and walked deliberately toward the center of the courtroom. He did not raise his voice. He did not match the theatrical desperation or the frantic pacing of the opposing counsel. He simply extended his hand, offering the thin manila folder directly to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. "Your Honor, my client has no intention of debating the fictional narrative presented by the plaintiff today." My attorney stated his tone perfectly, even and entirely professional. "We are not here to argue about emotional support or domestic contributions, because frankly, none of it is legally relevant to this court. We are submitting a single piece of evidence that renders this entire emergency petition completely null and void." I watched Andre from the corner of my eye. The smug little smirk that had been resting on his pale face began to crack. He leaned forward in his hospital transport wheelchair, straining his neck to see what was inside the folder. Loretta mirrored his movement, gripping the wooden back of the pew in front of her. Up in the gallery, Chloe went completely still. The judge opened the folder. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to review the yellow document inside. As she read, I let my mind drift back exactly 3 years to the night that specific document was created. I remembered the exact smell of the expensive bourbon Andre had poured himself when he walked through the front doors of my Buckhead estate. He was practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. He had just returned from a meeting with a group of shady private developers, and he was entirely convinced he was about to close a massive commercial zoning deal that would make him a multi-millionaire overnight. He truly believed he was about to become the undisputed king of Atlanta real estate. He had walked into my kitchen flanked by a notoriously aggressive contract lawyer he had hired. Andre slapped a thick stack of legal papers onto the marble island right in front of me. He looked down at me with a cold, patronizing smile and told me he needed to protect his future empire. He said he loved me, but business was business, and he could not risk me coming after his new massive wealth if our marriage ever hit a rough patch. He wanted a post-nuptial agreement. I demanded total and absolute financial separation. I thought I would cry. He thought I would be deeply insulted that my husband was trying to financially block me out of his life. He wanted me to beg him to share his imaginary fortune. He had no idea that I had already run background checks on his new business partners and knew his massive deal was nothing but a predatory scam designed to strip him of his capital. He also had no idea that my own public relations firm was already generating 7 figures in corporate contracts. I did not argue with him that night. I did not shed a single tear or act like the wounded wife. I picked up his expensive gold pen and I signed my name exactly where his aggressive lawyer pointed. I gave Andre exactly what he asked for: complete financial isolation. Your Honor, my attorney continued breaking me out of my memory. What you are reading is a legally binding postnuptial agreement executed 3 years ago. You will notice that it was drafted entirely by the plaintiff's own legal counsel. It was initiated solely by the plaintiff. Both parties signed it with full independent legal representation present. The judge flipped to the second page, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with sharp precision. Andre's lawyer jumped up from his chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. Your Honor, we object. My client was clearly not of sound mind. Or perhaps he was coerced into signing such a restrictive document by his wealthy wife. Coerced, the judge repeated, her voice, laced with heavy, absolute skepticism. Counselor. The document explicitly states that your client paid the retainer for the law firm that drafted this agreement. He was the petitioner. He brought this contract to his wife. Are you suggesting your client coerced himself into signing away his own marital rights? The slick lawyer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked down at Andre, who was now gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles had turned completely white. Andre knew exactly what was in that document. He had just desperately hoped I had forgotten about it or thrown the copy away. He gambled on my compliance, and he was currently bleeding out on the table. "Let me read this into the record, so there is absolutely no confusion," the judge said, her voice carrying a sharp, authoritative edge that demanded total silence. According to Section 4 of this postnuptial agreement, both parties agreed to a strict and irrevocable separation of all business and personal assets acquired before and during the marriage. It explicitly states that neither party shall have any claim to the corporate holdings, banking accounts, or real property titled in the other party's sole name. The judge looked directly over her glasses at Andre, piercing right through his pathetic, fragile victim act. Furthermore, it states that any debts, liabilities, or financial obligations incurred by either individual remain their sole and separate responsibility. And finally, Section 7 clearly outlines a mutual and permanent waiver of any and all spousal support alimony or maintenance, regardless of any future change in health or financial circumstance. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. I watched the realization hit Andre like a physical blow to the chest. The air completely left his lungs. His shoulders slumped forward. The master plan he had cooked up with Chloe, the massive payout he thought he was going to extract from my business, the millions of dollars he expected this judge to force me to hand over, it was all entirely destroyed by his own greedy signature. He had built a legal cage to lock me out of his imaginary wealth, and he had ended up locking himself inside a burning building with his own massive catastrophic debts. Hy is fully responsible for his own private debts. My attorney clarified for the court, driving the final nail into the coffin. My client's corporate assets, including her public relations firm and the corporate trust that owns her primary residence, are completely protected under the exact terms the plaintiff demanded 3 years ago. He has zero legal claim to her fortune. He has zero legal right to demand she pay for his private medical care. This lawsuit is a frivolous and malicious attempt to extort my client using the family court system. Loretta let out a loud, dramatic gasp from the front row. She grabbed the back of Andre's wheelchair, her hands shaking violently. "That cannot be legal," she cried out entirely, ignoring the strict rules of the courtroom. "My son is dying. She is his wife before God. She has to pay for his treatment. She owes him. Ma'am, if you speak out of turn in my courtroom again, I will have the baifs escort you to the street." The judge warned her tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or cultural manipulation. Loretta snapped her mouth shut, sinking back into the hard wooden bench, looking completely defeated. The righteous religious outrage she loved to perform had been entirely suffocated by the cold, hard reality of contract law. She could not bully a judge the way she bullied her church congregation. I slowly turned my head and looked toward the back of the gallery. Chloe was standing up. Her face was ashen, completely drained of all blood. She looked like she had just witnessed a horrific car crash. She was staring at the back of Andre's head with pure, unadulterated horror. Chloe finally understood the math. There was no 50% division of my corporate assets. There was no emergency spousal support. There was no money coming to save her. Andre was not a wealthy, successful man who was going to rescue her from the messy betrayal she had orchestrated against Terrence. He was a broke, sick man drowning in $350,000 of dangerous debt owed to ruthless people. Her house was going to be foreclosed on. Her husband had cut her off. She had thrown away her entire secure life for a man who had absolutely nothing to his name except a useless piece of paper he forced me to sign 3 years ago. Chloe did not wait for the judge to formally dismiss the case. She turned around, pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and practically ran out into the hallway. The sound of her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor echoed into the quiet courtroom, sealing her absolute ruin. She was retreating back to a life that was currently collapsing around her. I turned my attention back to the front of the room. Andre was staring at me from his wheelchair. The arrogant, vindictive energy that had fueled him just 20 minutes ago had completely vanished. He looked entirely hollowed out. He looked exactly like a man who had just realized he played a dangerous game of chess against a grandmaster and lost every single piece on the board. I did not offer him a sympathetic smile. I did not give him a look of gloating triumph or utter a single word of mockery. I simply held his gaze with cold, absolute indifference. I wanted him to know in his final moments of holding any delusion of power that I had been 10 steps ahead of him for years. He had tried to dig a massive grave for me, but he had only succeeded in burying himself. The judge removed her reading glasses and let them drop onto the heavy mahogany desk. The sharp clatter echoed like a final judgment across the silent room. She looked down at Andre and his lawyer with an expression of absolute judicial disgust. "Counselor," the judge said, her voice ringing with finality, "you brought a critically ill man into my courtroom to file an emergency injunction based on a deliberate suppression of material facts. You attempted to use this bench to override a legally binding contract that your own client initiated. This court is not a collection agency for private gambling debts and predatory loans." The slick lawyer tried to stammer out an apology, but the judge raised her hand, demanding total silence. "This emergency petition is dismissed with prejudice," she declared, striking her gavel against the sounding block. "The plaintiff is permanently barred from refiling this claim in any jurisdiction in this state. Furthermore, given the frivolous and malicious nature of this filing, I am ordering the plaintiff to cover 100% of the defense's legal fees payable within 30 days. Andre slumped so deeply into his transport wheelchair. I thought he might actually slide onto the floor. The oxygen machine at his feet hummed a steady, pathetic rhythm. His mother, Loretta, sat completely frozen in the pew behind him, her hands resting limply in her lap. The grand payout they had banked their entire lives on was officially gone. I stood up, buttoned my charcoal blazer, and walked out of the courtroom with my legal team. I did not look back. The domino effect of that single courtroom ruling was swift and absolutely merciless. Without my premium corporate insurance, Andre was immediately transferred from the specialized intensive care unit to a standard public ward. The hospital social worker visited him the very next morning with a stack of devastating paperwork. Because he was now a self-pay patient with zero liquid assets and massive documented debt, he was officially stripped of his priority status on the private organ transplant registry. He was placed at the absolute bottom of the state waiting list. The doctors informed him that without private funding, his wait time for a matching kidney would be anywhere from 5 to 7 years. He did not have 5 years. The reality of his physical and financial ruin settled over his hospital bed like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His medical crisis was only the beginning of his nightmare. The dangerous private lenders he owed $350,000 to did not care that he was dying. They only cared that his wealthy wife had legally cut him off. They started calling his hospital room. They started showing up at the public ward demanding their money. Andre was trapped in a failing body entirely at the mercy of ruthless creditors. Across town, Chloe was experiencing her own rapid descent into poverty. The moment she fled the courthouse, realizing there was no money coming to save her, she rushed back to the suburban house she shared with Terrence. She had planned to pack her expensive bags and formulate a new lie, but Terrence had already beaten her to it. Terrence was a highly respected high school principal with a firm moral compass, and he moved with ruthless efficiency. When Chloe pulled into her driveway, she found the locks completely changed. Terrence walked out onto the front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. He did not yell. He did not shed a single tear over the white woman who had tried to destroy his family. He handed her the envelope, which contained formally filed divorce papers and an immediate restraining order. Terrence had documented her text messages plotting with Andre and used them to secure a legal mandate keeping her off the property. Because her name was the only one on the underwater mortgage, Terrence washed his hands of the entire financial mess. 2 weeks later, the bank formally foreclosed on the property. Chloe lost her home, her marriage, and her comfortable lifestyle. She was forced to move into a cheap weekly motel, desperately searching for retail jobs. She had previously considered far beneath her. She had gambled her entire secure life on my destruction, and she ended up with absolutely nothing. But the most poetic justice of all fell squarely onto Loretta. Loretta had spent her entire adult life worshipping at the altar of social status. She cared more about her image in the affluent Black community than she cared about her own soul. But her grand illusions were completely shattered. The high society church friends who had witnessed her public humiliation at the business gala had entirely frozen her out. She was no longer invited to Sunday brunches or charity committee meetings. She was a social pariah, but the social exile was nothing compared to the financial terror she was about to face. The predatory lenders pursuing Andre realized he was a dead end, so they redirected their aggressive collection tactics straight toward his mother. They started showing up at Loretta's pristine, manicured lawn. They parked their dark vehicles outside her megachurch. They made it absolutely clear that if the $350,000 debt was not settled immediately, The consequences for her precious golden child would be severe and physically violent. Loretta was pushed completely into a corner. To save Andre from the predators, she had to sacrifice the only thing she truly loved. She had to sell her magnificent status symbol home. She listed the sprawling house at a desperate discount just to secure a rapid cash sale. I watched from afar as the moving trucks arrived at her property. She had to hold a humiliating public estate sale to liquidate her expensive antique furniture and her designer clothing just to cover the remaining balance of Andre's catastrophic debt. The wealthy neighbors she had always tried to impress walked through her home, picking through her belongings and whispering about her spectacular downfall. With her wealth completely drained and her social standing destroyed, Loretta was forced to move into a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment in a low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. There were no more grand dinner parties. There were no more boastful conversations about her successful developer son. She spent her days sitting in a tiny living room dealing with Andre's mounting medical bills and watching the life she felt so entitled to completely evaporate. They had all worked together to orchestrate a sophisticated plot to steal my life, my business, and my literal organs. They had operated with an arrogant, breathtaking cruelty, but they had fundamentally underestimated the woman they were trying to break. I did not have to raise my voice or lift a single finger to destroy them. I just had to step out of their way and let the heavy, crushing weight of their own actions pull them all the way down to the bottom. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the Fulton County Courthouse closed behind me. Half a year since a judge looked at a greedy, manipulative family and legally stripped them of their power to destroy my life. The suffocating autumn heat of Atlanta had long faded, replaced by the crisp, cool air of early spring. I was no longer fighting defensive battles against toxic people. I was completely unburdened, and I was rapidly expanding my territory on my own terms. Right now, I was sitting in the spacious first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight, heading straight for Paris. The soft hum of the massive jet engines was the only sound around me. I leaned back into the plush leather seat, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, and took a slow, deep breath. I was light years away from that freezing, sterile pre-op room at Emory University Hospital. I was light years away from the chaos, the screaming, and the profound disrespect that used to define my daily existence. I connected my smartphone to the premium and flight wireless network so I could check my business emails before we began our descent into Europe. The moment the satellite connection finalized, a single text message pushed its way through to my screen. The sender was an unknown number, but the desperate, pathetic tone of the message identified the author immediately. It was Andre. He must have borrowed a prepaid phone from one of the few people who still tolerated his miserable presence because I had completely blocked every single line of communication he previously owned. The message was a massive block of frantic, panicked text. He told me he was officially out of time. He told me his body was shutting down, and the doctors at the underfunded public ward could not do anything more for him without an immediate transplant. He begged for my forgiveness, with a pathetic desperation that made my stomach turn. He brought up our 10-year marriage, pleading with me to remember the good times we shared before he made his mistakes. He had the absolute audacity to call a premeditated plot to harvest my organs and steal my life insurance. A simple mistake. He told me I was his only hope. He asked me to please fly back to Atlanta to come back to the hospital and give him my kidney so he could have a second chance at life. I sat in my luxurious seat, suspended 30,000 feet in the air, and read the final desperate plea of a man facing the absolute end of his road. 6 months ago, that message might have elicited a spark of guilt or a heavy wave of profound sadness. I might have felt the toxic cultural pressure to save the black man I had married, regardless of how deeply he had tried to bury me. But I had spent the last half year completely detoxing my spirit from his manipulation. I looked at the words on the screen and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no pity. There was just the cold, hard reality that adult actions have permanent, devastating consequences. He tried to steal my life, my business, and my literal body parts to pay off his brother's wife. He built his own coffin with his greed and his arrogance. And now he was terrified of the dark. I did not type out a response. I did not tell him I forgave him or curse him for the trauma he caused. Engaging with a narcissist, even to reject them, is still giving them the attention they crave. I simply swiped left on the message thread. I tapped the delete button and I permanently blocked the new number. I set the phone face down on the polished console next to me and I did not give Andre another thought. I turned my attention back to the work I was traveling to Europe to finalize. My public relations and crisis management firm had seen a massive surge in high-profile international clients after I publicly dismantled my husband at the business gala. The corporate world respects a woman who knows exactly how to protect her empire. But securing my own wealth was no longer enough for me. I wanted to ensure that the hard lessons I learned could be used to fortify other women who looked exactly like me. During the past 6 months, I took a significant portion of my private wealth and established a multi-million-dollar grant foundation. The fund was exclusively designed to empower and financially back African-American women in business. I wanted to provide massive capital resources and top-tier legal representation to female entrepreneurs. I wanted to ensure they would never have to shrink their own brilliance to protect a fragile, insecure man the way I had done for a decade. I named the foundation after the concept of unyielding boundaries. We hosted national workshops teaching women how to secure their assets with ironclad contracts, how to navigate high-stakes corporate environments, and how to completely reject the toxic cultural conditioning that demands Black women sacrifice their own physical and emotional well-being to save people who refuse to save themselves. I turned the most horrific betrayal of my life into a massive legacy of economic empowerment. I took the fire they tried to burn me with, and I used it to light the way for thousands of other women. The flight attendant walked down the quiet aisle and offered me a warm, scented towel and a fresh glass of vintage champagne. I thanked her and looked out the oval window as the aircraft began its smooth descent into France. Hours later, I unlocked the heavy oak doors to my luxury penthouse suite at a 5-star hotel in the very heart of Paris. The suite was an absolute masterpiece of classic French architecture with soaring high ceilings, gilded mirrors, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I dropped my luggage by the door, walked straight across the polished hardwood floors, and pushed the glass doors open, stepping out onto the private wrought iron balcony. The cool evening air rushed over me. The city of lights stretched out in every direction, completely breathtaking and entirely mine to explore. The Seine River flowed quietly below, reflecting the streetlights like scattered diamonds on the dark water. In the near distance, the Eiffel Tower suddenly began to sparkle its brilliant golden lights, illuminating the dark Parisian sky. I stood on the balcony holding my crystal flute of champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the crisp, sweet taste of absolute freedom. I lowered the glass and reached my free hand down to my left side. I pressed my palm flat against my own waist, right over the exact spot where they were going to slice me open. I felt the steady rhythm of my own breath. I felt the absolute wholeness of my own body. My kidney was still right where it belonged, keeping me alive, keeping me strong, and keeping me moving forward. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I watched the golden lights dance across the water. I had walked into a slaughterhouse completely blind, but I had walked out the undisputed architect of my own salvation. I realized in that quiet, beautiful moment that the absolute best part of saving my own life was simply stepping back and letting them completely ruin theirs. The most profound lesson we can draw from these stories of betrayal and sweet revenge is that our true worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding us. In many families, especially within communities that heavily emphasize loyalty, keeping the peace and protecting the family image, victims of emotional or financial abuse are often pressured to shrink themselves. We are taught that setting strict boundaries is a form of betrayal, and that unconditional love means enduring unconditional disrespect. However, true empowerment is the exact moment you realize that you do not owe your success, your peace, or your literal livelihood to toxic relatives just because you share the same bloodline. Realizing this allows you to stop funding your own disrespect. Your strength lies not in yelling or seeking petty vengeance, but in the quiet, methodical building of your own independence. When you secure your assets, document the truth, and refuse to participate in their manufactured drama, you reclaim your absolute power. The ultimate justice is never about destroying them. It is about stepping out of their way, allowing their own greed to orchestrate their downfall while you unapologetically thrive and build your own chosen family life today. Have you ever had to protect your peace from the people who were supposed to protect you? Share your survival story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering content.